The British monarchy just crossed a line no one saw coming. While you were scrolling through your phone this morning, 700 farmers and ordinary voters were being rounded up and arrested across the United Kingdom. Their crime? Refusing to comply with the government's latest demands. And now King Charles has done something that's sending shockwaves through Buckingham Palace and Parliament alike. What happened in the last 60 minutes is about to change everything you thought you knew about the relationship between the Crown and the people. This isn't just another political scandal. This is the moment when a king decided he'd had enough of watching his people being silenced. The arrests began at dawn. Police vehicles rolled into farming communities across England, Scotland and Wales with arrest warrants in hand. The targets weren't criminals or terrorists. They were farmers who had refused to comply with Prime Minister Keir Starmer's new agricultural regulations and voters who had been labelled as non-compliant with recent government directives. By 6 a.m, the operation was in full swing. By 8 a.m, over 400 people were already in custody. By noon, that number had climbed to 700. And the entire time, one man was watching from Windsor Castle, his hands clenched, his jaw tight, his patience running dangerously thin. King Charles III had been receiving hourly updates since the operation began. Sources inside the palace reveal that with each report, the king's demeanour grew darker. He paced the corridors of Windsor, demanding more information, questioning his advisors and making phone calls that left staff members visibly shaken. The king wasn't just concerned, he was furious. And when a monarch gets furious in modern Britain, things get complicated very quickly. Because while the king technically has no political power, he has something far more potent in this moment. He has a voice that can rally millions. And he's about to use it in a way that no British monarch has dared to in generations. The farmers being arrested weren't random troublemakers. These were fourth and fifth generation agricultural workers who had refused to implement new environmental compliance measures that they claimed would bankrupt their operations. The regulations, introduced by Starmer's Labour government just 3 months ago, required immediate and expensive changes to farming practices. Farmers who couldn't afford the upgrades or who questioned the scientific basis of the regulations were given a choice: comply or face penalties. When hundreds refused, the government made good on its threats. The penalties came in the form of police at their doors. The voters being arrested alongside them had committed the modern crime of vocal dissent. They had organised protests, signed petitions and spoken out against what they saw as government overreach. In Starmer's Britain, that was apparently enough to warrant arrest. The legal justification for these mass arrests came from a hastily passed bill that expanded the definition of public disorder and non-compliance with government mandates. Civil liberties groups had warned that the legislation was dangerously broad, giving authorities sweeping powers to silence opposition under the guise of maintaining public order. Those warnings were ignored by Parliament. Now, those warnings were proving prophetic. The arrests were technically legal, but legality and justice are not always the same thing. And sitting in Windsor Castle, King Charles was grappling with that exact distinction. He had sworn an oath to uphold the laws of the land, but he had also sworn to protect his people. What happens when those two duties collide? The palace had been preparing a carefully worded statement expressing general concern about civil liberties. It was the kind of diplomatic non-statement that monarchs have perfected over centuries. Say something that sounds meaningful but commits to nothing. Express concern without taking sides. Acknowledge the situation without actually doing anything about it. The statement was drafted, reviewed and ready for release. And then King Charles read it, crumpled it up and told his private secretary that he would be writing his own statement. What came next was not the measured response of a constitutional monarch. It was the outburst of a man who had watched silently for too long and decided that silence had become complicity. Within the royal household, panic set in immediately. Constitutional experts were summoned, legal advisors were consulted, former prime ministers were contacted for their input. Everyone was asking the same question: how far can a king go in criticising his own government without triggering a constitutional crisis? The answer, historically, has been not very far at all. The British monarchy survives by staying above politics, by never choosing sides, by being a symbol rather than a participant. But King Charles has never been particularly good at following that script. Throughout his decades as Prince of Wales, he repeatedly pushed boundaries, wrote letters to ministers, and advocated for causes he believed in. He was criticised for it then. He was warned that as king, such behaviour would be impossible. Now, faced with the arrest of 700 of his subjects for the crime of disagreement, Charles was about to prove that being impossible doesn't mean not doing it. The statement that King Charles personally drafted and insisted on releasing was unlike anything a British monarch had said in modern times. There was no diplomatic hedging, no carefully balanced acknowledgement of all perspectives. Instead, there were 4 paragraphs that cut straight to the heart of what was happening. The king stated that he had been informed of the mass arrests taking place across his kingdoms. He expressed not just concern, but alarm at the scale and nature of these actions. He reminded his government and his people that the strength of Britain had always been its respect for the voice of ordinary citizens, including and especially when those voices expressed dissent. And then came the line that no one expected. The king wrote that he could not remain silent when he saw the fundamental freedoms of his people being compromised in the name of compliance. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Within minutes of the palace releasing the king's statement, social media erupted. News channels interrupted their regular programming. Political commentators scrambled to analyse what had just happened. Had the king just openly criticised his prime minister? Had he just sided with the arrested farmers and protesters against his own government? The answer to both questions appeared to be yes, and the implications were staggering. In Downing Street, Keir Starmer was in an emergency meeting with his cabinet when the news broke. Sources say the Prime Minister's face went pale as he read the King's words on his phone. He immediately understood what everyone was beginning to realise. The government had just been publicly rebuked by the Crown. For Starmer, this was a political nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Labour had come to power promising to restore stability and competence after years of Conservative chaos. Instead, just months into his premiership, Starmer was now facing off against the monarchy itself. The optics were disastrous. A Labour Prime Minister arresting farmers and silencing voters, while the King defended those same citizens. It looked like class warfare, it looked like authoritarian overreach, it looked like exactly the kind of elitist disconnect that had destroyed previous governments. And worse, it was all true. The arrests were real. The King's criticism was justified. And now Starmer had to decide how to respond without making things even worse. The Prime Minister's options were all bad. He could ignore the King's statement, which would make him look weak and dismissive of the monarchy. He could defend the arrests, which would make him look like an authoritarian silencing dissent. He could back down and halt the arrests, which would make him look like he caved to royal pressure and had no conviction in his own policies. Or he could escalate by publicly criticising the king for overstepping his constitutional role, which could trigger the constitutional crisis that everyone was desperately trying to avoid. Starmer chose the fourth option, and in doing so, he made everything infinitely worse. Within 2 hours of the king's statement, Downing Street released its own response. It was defensive, legalistic, and dripping with barely concealed anger. The government statement reminded everyone that Britain is a constitutional monarchy where Parliament is supreme. It insisted that the arrests were lawful actions taken to maintain public order and enforce democratically passed legislation. It expressed surprise and disappointment that the king had chosen to involve himself in what was clearly a matter for elected officials. And then it included a paragraph that historians will likely point to as the moment everything changed. The statement said that while the government had the deepest respect for His Majesty, it hoped that the King would remember his constitutional obligation to remain above politics and to support the government of the day in carrying out its lawful duties. It was a warning, a threat even. Stay in your lane or else. The British public's reaction split along predictable but intensifying lines. Those who had been concerned about government overreach saw the king as a hero, standing up for ordinary people when their elected representatives had failed them. Farmers, rural communities, and anyone sceptical of Starmer's policies rallied behind the king with an enthusiasm that bordered on monarchist fervour. Suddenly, King Charles, who had never been as popular as his mother, was being hailed as a defender of British liberty. Meanwhile, Republicans, left-wing activists, and Starmer loyalists saw the king's intervention as proof that the monarchy was an outdated and dangerous institution interfering with democracy. They demanded that Charles apologise, that Parliament assert its authority, and that serious questions be asked about whether Britain still needed a monarchy at all. The 700 arrested individuals became instant symbols. Their names, faces, and stories flooded the media. There was Margaret Thornton, a 64-year-old sheep farmer from Yorkshire who had farmed the same land for 40 years and refused to install expensive monitoring equipment she couldn't afford. There was David Chen, a 32-year-old voter from Manchester who had organised a peaceful protest against the compliance measures and was arrested for allegedly encouraging others to break the law. There was Eleanor Price, a 58-year-old teacher and mother of 3 who had written a viral social media post criticising the government and was arrested for spreading what authorities called harmful misinformation. These weren't extremists or criminals. They were ordinary British citizens whose only crime was disagreement. And now they had the king himself defending their right to exist in civil society. Behind the scenes, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Senior members of the royal family were reportedly furious with Charles for creating this crisis. Prince William was said to be particularly concerned about the long-term damage to the monarchy's reputation and viability. Royal advisors were working around the clock to find a way to walk back the king's statement without making him look weak or insincere. But Charles wasn't interested in backing down. Sources close to the king say he believes this is a defining moment that history will judge whether he stood up for his people or remained silent in the face of injustice. He has reportedly told his advisors that he's prepared to face whatever consequences come from speaking out, because the alternative, watching silently as his subjects are arrested for dissent, is something he cannot live with. Parliament was in chaos. An emergency session was called with MPs from all parties demanding answers, explanations and action. The Speaker of the House had to call for order repeatedly as heated debates turned into shouting matches. Conservative MPs, seeing an opportunity to wound the Labour government, demanded Starmer's resignation and the immediate release of all arrested individuals. They accused the Prime Minister of authoritarian tactics unworthy of a British democracy. Labour MPs rallied to defend their leader, insisting that the arrests were lawful and necessary and that the king had grossly overstepped his constitutional boundaries. Liberal Democrats and smaller parties were split, with some supporting the king's moral stance and others worried about the precedent of royal intervention in political matters. The debate in Parliament revealed something uncomfortable that many had suspected but few had wanted to acknowledge. Britain's unwritten constitution is only as strong as the mutual respect and restraint shown by those who operate within it. The monarchy doesn't interfere in politics because it chooses not to, not because it legally cannot. Parliament tolerates the monarchy because the monarchy stays out of Parliament's way. But what happens when that informal agreement breaks down? What happens when a king decides that constitutional convention is less important than standing up for what he believes is right? Britain was about to find out, and the answer was proving to be messy, complicated, and potentially explosive. Outside Parliament, protests erupted across the country. In London, thousands gathered outside Buckingham Palace in a show of support for the king, waving Union Jacks and chanting slogans about freedom and rights. In contrast, outside Downing Street, a different crowd demanded Starmer stand firm against royal interference and uphold parliamentary sovereignty. The two groups eventually met in Trafalgar Square, and what started as competing demonstrations nearly turned into violent clashes before police separated the crowds. Britain, usually so reserved and controlled in its political expressions, was experiencing something it hadn't seen in decades. Genuine public anger and division over fundamental questions about power, rights, and who really speaks for the people. The international reaction added another layer of complexity. Other constitutional monarchies watched nervously, wondering if Britain's crisis could spread to their own countries. would other monarchs feel emboldened to speak out on political matters? The President of the United States issued a bland statement expressing confidence in Britain's democratic institutions. The European Union was carefully silent, unwilling to comment on what was clearly an internal British matter, but undoubtedly concerned about stability in one of Europe's major powers. Russia and China, always happy to point out Western hypocrisy, had a field day with their propaganda machines painting Britain as a nation in collapse where even the king was fighting his own government. Back at Windsor Castle, King Charles was receiving delegations throughout the day. Former prime ministers came to counsel restraint. Religious leaders came to offer support and prayers. Constitutional scholars came to explain the legal implications of what he had done. Through it all, Charles remained resolute. Those who met with him described a man who was calm, determined, and at peace with his decision. He acknowledged the crisis he had created, but maintained that some things are worth creating a crisis over. The arrest of 700 people for the crime of dissent, he told one visitor, is exactly such a thing. If a king cannot speak up in that moment, then what is the point of having a king at all? The question of what would happen to the arrested individuals became the immediate tactical battleground. The government insisted they would all face charges and legal proceedings according to the law. Civil rights groups were preparing mass legal challenges, arguing that the arrests violated fundamental freedoms protected by British law and international human rights conventions. The king, through unofficial channels, let it be known that he was personally monitoring the situation and expected every arrested individual to receive fair treatment and due process. The implicit threat was clear. If they didn't, he would speak out again, and next time it might be even more forcefully. Some of those arrested were released on bail within hours, but many remained in custody. The conditions of their detention became a source of public concern and outrage. Reports emerged of farmers being held in cells designed for violent criminals, of protesters being denied access to legal counsel for hours, of intimidation tactics being used during interrogations. Each report fueled more public anger and gave more ammunition to the king's supporters, who argued that his intervention had been not just justified but necessary. The government's response was to clamp down harder, insisting that the rule of law meant everyone, regardless of public sympathy, had to face consequences for breaking the law. But the harder Starmer pushed, the worse he looked, and the more heroic King Charles appeared by contrast. The media was having its own crisis trying to cover this story. Traditional journalistic objectivity demanded presenting both sides equally. But how do you equally present a story where one side is arresting farmers and the other is the king defending them? Right-wing newspapers went all in supporting Charles with headlines about the king standing up for Britain and Starmer's assault on freedom. Left-wing publications tried to focus on constitutional concerns and the danger of royal power, but even they struggled to make the government look good in this scenario. International media portrayed it as Britain's biggest constitutional crisis in generations, which only increased the pressure on everyone involved to find a resolution before things spiralled even further out of control. By evening, the situation had reached a critical point. Keir Starmer requested an audience with the king. Such requests are traditionally granted immediately, but palace officials made Starmer wait for 3 hours before confirming that His Majesty would receive the Prime Minister. That delay was itself a message. When Starmer finally arrived at Windsor Castle, he was not greeted with the usual ceremonial warmth. The meeting was private, with no advisors present on either side, which is highly unusual for a monarch's meeting with their Prime Minister. What was said in that room remains unknown, but both men emerged looking grim and shaken. Within an hour of the meeting ending, both the government and the palace released new statements. Starmer announced that the government would be reviewing the cases of all 700 arrested individuals, and that those who posed no risk to public order would be released pending further legal proceedings. It wasn't a full capitulation, but it was a significant retreat. The palace's statement was shorter and more measured than the king's earlier intervention.